On July 25, 1984, a 35-year-old woman named Zhao Xiaolian stood in her doorway talking to an agitated man in Liaoyuan City in northeastern China. The man was a friend of Zhao's husband, Li, and he kept pacing back and forth, and he was loud and very animated when he spoke. Zhao glanced over her shoulder and saw her 7-year-old daughter drawing a picture at a small table in the front room, and Zhao turned and asked her husband's friend to please keep his voice down. The man nodded and then did lower his voice, and then told Zhao everything was going to be okay. By the end of the night, she wouldn't have to worry or keep the secret she was hiding anymore. She just needed to follow the instructions he had given her. The man then said goodbye and wished her luck. Zhao closed the door and just stood there in silence for a second. Then she forced a smile onto her face and turned and walked over to her daughter. Zhao was about 5'3" tall, with black hair and dark brown eyes, and her daughter looked a lot like her. Zhao told her daughter she could finish her drawing later, because for now, she was going to go stay with her uncle for a while. And right away, Zhao's daughter's face lit up and she ran to the door. Zhao followed her and slipped on her favorite pair of shoes. They were red sandals with a low heel. Then she took her daughter's hand and they both walked outside. The pair made their way through the neighborhood that lay on the outskirts of the city, not far from the surrounding mountains. The streets were lined with small gray wooden houses, and Zhao basically knew everybody who lived in these houses. This was a neighborhood where multiple generations of families had grown up right alongside each other. Usually, that was something Zhao loved about this place, that sense of community. But now, all she could imagine were her neighbors staring out at her from their windows, trying to figure out the secret that she was hiding from everyone. After walking for a few more minutes, Zhao's daughter let go of her mother's hand and ran down the street to her uncle's house and then knocked on the door. As this happened, Zhao prayed her brother was actually home. In 1984, nobody where Zhao lived had a car. In fact, even bicycles were seen as a luxury. If people needed to travel for work, they could catch a bus or a train from the city center, but typically, they just walked everywhere. The people in this area at the time also did not have telephones, so if they wanted to get in touch with somebody out of town, they wrote letters. And if they needed to talk to someone close by, they simply walked over to their house to see them. So it was not uncommon to show up at somebody's house unannounced and to find that nobody was home. But luckily, Zhao saw her brother open up his door and he hugged Zhao's daughter, and as this happened, Zhao felt like a huge weight had been lifted. She got to the house, and before her brother could say anything, she told him that she needed him to watch her daughter, while she walked to the clinic in town to see a doctor. He said of course, he'd love to watch his niece, but he asked Zhao was she okay? Zhao said it was no big deal, she just had a little stomach ache and wanted to get some medicine for it. Zhao then thanked her brother, hugged her daughter tight, and said she loved her. Once her brother closed the door behind them, Zhao turned and started walking. But she did not head to the clinic. Instead, she rushed back home. When Zhao got there, she immediately walked to the back of her house and found her bicycle leaning up against a wall on the small back patio. Zhao's husband, Li, had a good job at a supply company, and Zhao had a well-paying job at a government textile factory. So together, as a two-income family, they were able to afford certain things, like bicycles, that many of their neighbors could not. Zhao rolled the bike to the street in front of her house. She saw the sun beginning to disappear behind the mountains, and she knew it was going to be dark soon. So she put her red sandals on the pedals and rode off as fast as she could. The following day, around noontime, an old farmer wiped the sweat dripping down his forehead. He'd spent hours doing back-breaking work, and he needed a rest. He walked south and could hear the running water of the Weijin River nearby. The farmer made his way to the edge of his land, and the river came into view. But suddenly, the farmer stopped. Part of the riverbank, about 10 feet from the water, was overgrown with trees and bushes. But through the weeds, the farmer saw something strange laying near one of the trees. He tried to block the sunlight to get a better view, but he still couldn't quite tell what he was looking at. He walked closer and stared at the ground right near the tree, and suddenly a look of pure horror crossed his face. He took off running across a shallow part of the river and headed toward the city center that was over 12 miles away. He left the river and farmland behind, running faster than he had in years. And he kept on running for the entire 12 miles, until he got to the city center and arrived at the local police station. The farmer walked through the door and tried to catch his breath, and as he did, 2 officers quickly walked over to him and asked what was wrong. He told them they needed to come with him to the river right away, but the officers told the farmer to just rest for a minute and explain what was going on here. However, the story the farmer told them was so shocking, they thought the old man must be confused. But the farmer insisted he knew what he was talking about and begged them to follow him. So eventually, the officers called over a few other cops and told the farmer to lead the way. The farmer, still exhausted from his run, led the police out of the station, and then they all walked 12 miles back to the river. When they finally got there, the 2 officers followed the farmer to a tree on the riverbank, and right away they could see the old man had been telling the truth. But they still didn't want to believe what their eyes were seeing, because laying on the ground, the officers saw a naked, charred corpse. They could tell it was a woman who was maybe a little over 5 feet tall, and she had severe burns all over her body. The burns were so bad that it was impossible to make out her facial features, let alone see any identifying marks. The officers tried to stay calm, but they had never seen anything like this before. They spent most of their shifts breaking up fights in town or occasionally investigating robberies. That was it. The 2 officers walked away from the body and joined the other cops, who also had no experience in a case like this. But they did know they had to search the area for potential clues. So they split into teams, with one group searching the riverbank and the other searching the nearby farmland. On the riverbank, about 20 feet from the body, something caught one of the cops' attention. It was a woman's burned blouse and pants and a pair of red sandals. Just then, another officer called out, and the cop staring at the clothes and the sandals snapped to attention. Then he joined the other group and saw them looking at a single set of footprints on the riverbank. And it didn't take them long to match those prints to the red sandals. The police continued to search the area, but they didn't find anything else that stood out. And since they had a body and only one pair of footprints that matched the red sandals they'd found, they thought they'd figured it out. This woman had come to the river alone, set herself on fire on the riverbank, and taken her own life. The following day, July 27th, a detective named Soon Eugene sat at the back of a small, brightly lit meeting room at the local police station. Detective Soon was in his early 30s and had black hair and dark eyes. He listened to a group of officers talking to the police chief about the autopsy report they had received for the body they discovered by the river. Soon had not been a part of the group at the river, but he needed to speak to the chief, so he sat there and waited. The officer said that the autopsy report did not identify the woman, but it gave a pretty clear picture of how she died. The body had not been burned after death. She had black carbon foam in her lungs and blood vessels, and that indicated she had been breathing while she was burning. This meant the fire and related smoke inhalation had killed her, and so these officers were saying they felt like that confirmed their theory, that this woman had basically lit herself on fire to commit suicide. And at this, Detective Soon, who had been quiet to this point, sat up in his chair and shouted, "I disagree." The officers immediately turned and just glared at him. Some people in town said Detective Soon was smarter than everybody else, but a few of his colleagues thought he was just plain arrogant. One of the officers pointed out that Soon had not been at the river, so he couldn't possibly know what had happened. But the police chief chimed in and asked Soon why he disagreed. Soon nodded and walked to the front of the room. Then, with the captive audience in front of him, he said, first, self-immolation, setting yourself on fire, was a rare way for somebody to kill themselves. And often when self-immolation occurred, the person doing it was doing it to make a political statement of some kind. And so Soon did not think this woman, who was found in the middle of nowhere and didn't leave a message behind, was making some sort of statement. Before the other officers could argue, Soon said there was actually an easier way to prove this woman didn't kill herself. He said the officers had searched the entire area near the river, but they hadn't found a gas can or any other container that could have held the fuel that burned her. So either this woman doused herself in gasoline and then walked for miles before lighting herself on fire, or, and Soon said this was way more likely, someone else doused her in some sort of fuel, murdered her by setting her on fire, and then ran off with the gas can. The officers just stared at Soon. Even if he was arrogant, most of them admitted he had made a good point. But an officer asked him, well, okay, if somebody else killed her, why was there only one set of footprints? which appeared to be the dead woman's footprints. Detective Soon said that was a great question, and they would need to look into that. But it was hardly a reason to chalk this whole thing up to suicide. Soon told the police chief he was sure they had a murder case on their hands, and he knew he could solve it. And the chief didn't hesitate. He said okay, they would treat the woman found at the river as a homicide victim, and Detective Soon would lead the investigation. Later that day, Soon walked to the river with several other officers. He held a file folder of photographs that had been taken at the scene the day before. Soon knew that some of his colleagues wished he had kept his mouth shut. It would have been a lot easier if they deemed this a suicide, closed the case, and simply moved on. But Soon was sure he had made the right call. He refused to believe that a woman could just set herself on fire and not leave any trace of how she'd done it or why. And when Soon stared down at the footprints that were still on the riverbank, he knew he was right. He crouched down and took out a photograph of the red sandals the police had found there the day before. He glanced between the footprints and the photo, and he knew the officers had been right. The prints matched the sandals. But Soon caught something else the others had missed. He gently pressed his hand down into the ground not far from the footprints, and he was able to make a handprint. However, the ground was so wet that the moment he removed his hand, that print quickly vanished. It was like the ground kind of ate it back up, like water had washed it away. Soon looked at the photo again and fixated on the heels of the red sandals. They weren't high heels, but they were thick and solid, definitely heavy enough to leave a deeper footprint, whereas a lighter, flatter shoe might not have left a mark at all, and they would have just vanished like his handprint. Soon still did not have a clear picture of what had happened here, but he knew things would become a whole lot clearer as soon as he identified the victim, the dead woman who had worn those red sandals. The following morning, Detective Soon was sitting at his desk studying the crime scene photos when he heard somebody call his name. Soon looked up and saw an officer standing next to a man who looked like he had not slept in a long time. Soon asked if this man needed his help, and the man told him he was really worried. His older sister, Zhao, had been missing for days. Soon looked around and saw there was an empty office in the corner, so he scooped up the file folder with the crime scene photos inside and then led Zhao's brother into the office and closed the door behind them. Once they sat down at the small table inside the office, Soon asked the man when was the last time he had seen his sister. He said Zhao had dropped off his niece a couple of days ago before going to the clinic, but she never came back. So he'd brought his niece to his other sister's house and then spent a whole day walking everywhere and talking to everyone to see if they had heard from Zhao, but nobody had. Soon looked at the man with pity in his eyes. The man was already so upset, and Soon hated that he was about to cause him a whole lot more pain. Soon opened the file folder and pulled out photos of the woman's blouse and the red sandals that had been found at the river. He asked Zhao's brother if he recognized the clothing. Zhao's brother stared at the photos and started shaking his head like he didn't want to accept what he was seeing. But eventually, he looked up and said, yes, those are definitely Zhao's clothes. Soon told the man he was very sorry to say this, but they had recently found his sister's body near the river, and he believed someone had murdered her. Zhao's brother immediately broke down sobbing. Soon gave the man a couple of minutes to compose himself, and then he apologized for pressing him at a time like this, but he wanted to know why Zhao's husband had not already reported his wife missing. Zhao's brother wiped the tears away from his face. Then he said that Zhao's husband, Li, was on a business trip hours away, so he wouldn't have had any idea about what was going on. Detective Soon promised he would find whoever had done this, and then he asked Zhao's brother to please not speak publicly about his sister's death. Soon believed holding back information could be crucial in identifying the killer. Zhao's brother nodded and said that he and his other sister would not say a word. Later that day, Detective Soon walked through Zhao's house to her and her husband's bedroom. Now, this was not a crime scene, but Soon hoped something there might point him in the right direction. He searched the dresser and bedside tables, but didn't find anything that stood out. He crossed the room and opened up the drawer of a wooden desk that was pressed against the wall. Inside, he found playing cards, photos, and a blue hardcover notebook. He opened up the notebook and looked at the first page, and quickly realized this was Zhao's diary. Sun flipped through the diary and found the last entry. It was dated just a few days before her death. He read the entry, and it really took him by surprise, because basically it was one complaint after another about her husband, Lee. And all these complaints basically boiled down to the same thing. Zhao clearly believed that Lee cared more about money than about his family. Detective Sun bagged the diary as evidence. Now he just needed to track down Zhao's husband. A few hours later, Detective Sun and members of his team met with Lee's boss at the supply company where he worked. And Sun got right to the point and said the police needed to find Lee right away. They knew he was traveling for business, so Sun asked where Lee had gone and where he was staying. But the boss got this confused look on his face. He said Lee was not on a business trip. Lee had been away from work, but because he had said he had this family issue that he needed to attend to. Sun didn't say anything in response to this, but this seemed like a major revelation. It meant Lee had very likely lied about where he was, at least to his boss and to his brother-in-law. Sun asked to see where Lee worked, and the boss led the police to an office filled with several desks. He then pointed them to Lee's desk and then left the cops on their own. Sun began rifling through Lee's desk, and under a stack of papers, he found a photograph of a woman, and it was not Zhao. Then, Detective Sun caught a break that could only happen in a small, tight-knit community where basically everybody knew each other. One of the other officers who was with Sun looked at the photo of this woman and said he recognized her. He couldn't remember her name, but he was sure she had been Lee's girlfriend when they were younger. Detective Sun felt like he was onto something big. He already suspected Lee in this murder, and now this piece of evidence helped him come up with a theory. Maybe Lee murdered his wife and then went on the run to be with his old girlfriend. And lying about the business trip would have given Lee cover to be out of town for a couple of days before anybody thought something suspicious was going on. For the rest of the day, investigators spoke to Lee's friends, and finally, they found a man who could identify the woman in the photo. The man told them that the woman was definitely Lee's ex-girlfriend, but she had gotten married years ago and moved to a city that was about a 3-hour train ride away. So, the following morning, 2 days after Zhao's body had been found, Sun took a train ride. And he found Lee's ex-girlfriend at her house, but he realized pretty quickly this was a waste of time. Lee's ex answered all of Sun's questions, but she said she had not seen Lee or even exchanged letters with him in over a decade. So Sun turned right around and hopped back on the train for the long ride back home. And during this ride, Sun felt frustrated. He felt totally lost. Lee really seemed to have fled, but now Sun had no idea where to look for him. And he knew Lee had at least a couple of days' jump on him. Moreover, traveling by train through smaller towns in this region would allow Lee to almost completely disappear, because a lot of those trains didn't require a passenger to provide identification. Sun could ask for help from other police departments, but Lee could be almost anywhere in China by this point. Hours later, Sun got back to the police station, and he was surprised when the chief greeted him with a huge smile on his face. Sun asked him if there had been some miraculous break in the case while he was gone. The chief said no, nothing like that had happened. However, he did have something exciting to show him. The chief walked with Sun out back behind the station, and immediately Sun's face lit up. The other officers were all out there, standing next to a row of brand new bicycles. The chief told Sun he had met with members of the city government and discussed the murder case they were dealing with, and he told them it was larger in scope than anything they had ever dealt with. And so the city government wanted to help the police solve the crime, and they figured by giving them bicycles, that would help them cover more ground and also just generally speed up the process. Even though Sun had spent most of the day feeling really bad about his investigation, feeling like it was going nowhere, now he couldn't help but feel rejuvenated. These bikes were a huge deal. It meant his team could travel much farther and talk to more people far more efficiently. And Sun reminded himself that this was a community where almost everybody knew everybody. So someone out there had to know something about Lee that could point the police in the right direction. They just had to go out there and find that person. Over the next several days, Soon and his team were out in force on their bikes, speaking to Lee's friends, his family, and just people all over the community. And finally, about a week after the discovery of Zhao's body, their work paid off. Police got a tip from a factory worker in town. The man didn't say much, but he told them to take a closer look into a robbery that had taken place at the factory's warehouse. Soon was quite familiar with this robbery. It had been a big deal in town. A large quantity of expensive steel pipes had been stolen from that warehouse, but the case had gone unsolved for months. Soon didn't see how stolen pipes could possibly connect to Zhao's murder, but he'd been desperate for any new leads, and now he felt like he had one. So he took his bike and rode right over to the warehouse. When Soon walked inside, he saw men driving lifts through this vast open space, transporting materials across the floor to get ready for shipping. One of the shift managers waved at Soon and then trotted across the floor to meet him. The guy was in his late 20s, and he introduced himself as Ho Lei Chiang. He led Soon into a nearby office that he said would be quieter than the warehouse floor. Once inside, Soon took a seat at a desk across from Ho and right away asked him what he knew about the missing steel pipes. Ho said he didn't know much, just that 8 tons of steel had been taken. And also, he said whoever pulled the job must have had access to the warehouse equipment, trucks, and a team of people. Ripping off that much steel was not a fast or easy job. The detective agreed. It must have been an enormous undertaking. So he asked Ho if there was anybody he could think of who might have been capable of pulling something like that off. All of a sudden, Ho seemed nervous. Sun picked up on it and asked if he was okay, and in a quiet voice, Ho said he did have an idea about who was behind the robbery, but he was afraid to say. Sun leaned forward and told Ho he needed to talk, because otherwise, people would think he was covering up for a criminal. Ho nodded and then said there was a man police needed to look into. He was a guy who worked for a local supply company, and his name was Li Xiangdong. Detective Sun felt like he had just been given a huge gift. It looked like he could have a clear connection between the warehouse robbery and Li, his murder victim's husband, who apparently had gone on the run. A couple weeks later, in early August, Detective Soon and his team continued to collect more information on Lee's possible involvement in the warehouse robbery. But they still weren't any closer to tracking him down. Soon sat at his desk, poring over his notes from the robbery and the murder case like he did every day. And suddenly, he heard someone run into the building screaming. It was a man who was dripping with sweat and looked like he might pass out. Soon ran over to him, grabbed the man a chair so he could sit down, and asked him what was wrong. The man told him he had been out walking in the mountains just outside of town, and he saw these 4 guys pour gasoline over another man and then light him on fire. For a second, Soon just stood there in shock. But then he snapped out of it, got the exact location of where this man had been, and then he rallied his team together. The officers all ran outside, got on their bikes, and rode off to investigate their second burned body in a matter of weeks. The area where this man had come from, where he had seen this guy get lit on fire, was about 9 miles away from where Zhao had been found. And when the investigators arrived there, they left their bikes and walked down this long tree-lined path toward a clearing near the foot of a mountain. And as they got closer, the smell of burning flesh filled the air. Eventually, the investigators walked into a clearing. And there, they were quite surprised to find 4 men still standing over a body that had smoke rising from it. The men's heads were bowed, almost in reverence. Detective Sun immediately began to approach these men to potentially apprehend them, but none of the men tried to flee the scene like he expected them to. Instead, when they noticed him coming, one of these men just told the detective that nothing illegal was going on here. The police had simply stumbled onto a sacred ritual. Now, Detective Sun was not the most religious guy, but he was pretty sure no legal rituals included burning someone alive. But the man explained to him they were not burning someone who was alive. They were burning a dead body. All of them were miners, and their friend had died in a mining accident. They believed that someone who died in an accident should not be buried in a cemetery. Instead, the body had to be burned. Sun just stared at the man. He had no idea what to think about this. He would need to check with the mine to see if someone really had died in an accident, and he would need to research religious customs to see if these men were telling the truth. And on top of all that, he now had absolutely no idea if this burning body had any connection to Zhao's murder. But as Sun stood there looking at the burnt body on the ground, something hit him. It was so obvious that he got mad at himself for taking this long to think of it. Just like with Zhao, the man on the ground was so badly burned that it would be impossible to identify him by his looks. Sun turned to one of the other officers, and he could barely contain his excitement. He said he had just realized that the reason Zhao's killer had burned her was so she would be totally unrecognizable. And more importantly, because police had kept the news of Zhao's death out of the media, the killer probably believed Zhao still had not been identified. And suddenly, Sun had a plan to draw the killer out of hiding. Other members of Sun's team dealt with the body that was found near the mountain, and they would quickly discover the miners had been telling the truth about what they were doing. And as bizarre and unsettling as the ritual had seemed to Sun, it had actually been a huge help to his investigation, and he quickly put the first part of his new plan into action. Sun visited with Zhao's brother and sister. He asked them to start talking publicly about how they were both going to be interviewed soon by the police about a possible murder. Sun felt certain that the news that Zhao's brother and sister were going to meet with the cops would get back to the killer. And Sun believed that the killer, at that point, would reach out to Zhao's siblings in an attempt to keep them from speaking to the police. And it would not take long for Sun to be proven right. 3 days after Sun set his plan in motion, Zhao's sister walked out of her house and found a letter taped to her window. She read it and immediately ran to her brother's house, and then together they brought the letter to Detective Sun. The letter was from Zhao's husband, Li. It said that he and Zhao were together and they were okay, but they had gotten mixed up in something pretty bad, so they had to flee the city for now. They knew their daughter would be taken care of for the time being, and they'd get back in touch as soon as it was safe. Li closed it out by telling his sister-in-law to burn the letter. When Sun read this letter, he knew they were close to solving this case. It would take Sun and his team a bit more time to tie everything together, but soon would figure out exactly what happened to Zhao. Based on the letter that Zhao's sister received, crime scene evidence, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, this is what police believe happened to Zhao on July 25, 1984. The killer stood next to their bicycle at the end of Zhao's street as the sun set behind the mountains. They heard bike tires on the road and saw Zhao coming their way. The killer smiled at Zhao, got on their bike, and started riding right alongside her. As it got darker, the killer pulled in front of Zhao and led her towards the river, not too far from their neighborhood. As the killer did this, they told Zhao they wouldn't have to ride much further, and soon they would both be able to forget about the secret they were both hiding. The killer and Zhao reached the riverbank, and from there they could see farmland on the other side of the river. The killer said they would need to cross the river and get to that farmland. So Zhao got off her bike and laid it on the ground, as did the killer, and then she and the killer walked across the river, which was very shallow, and then when they reached the other side and were on that riverbank, the killer's footprints very quickly disappeared from the wet ground. However, Zhao's did not. Zhao began to head up for the farmland, but the killer grabbed her by the arm, leaned in close, and whispered something in her ear. And as soon as they did, Zhao's eyes went wide and she began to tremble in fear, and she shoved the killer and tried to run, but the killer grabbed her from behind, threw her to the ground, and ripped off her shirt and pants. The killer sexually assaulted Zhao. The whole time, Zhao remained quiet and submissive, perhaps hoping that when this was over, she'd be let go. But no. When the killer was done, they wrapped their hands around Zhao's neck and began choking her. Zhao coughed and fought for air, but eventually everything went black. The killer tossed Zhao's clothes right next to her, and then walked to the nearby farm where they'd hidden a gas can. They returned to the riverbank and poured gasoline all over Zhao. Then they stepped several feet away from her, put the gas can down, lit a match, and threw it on Zhao. Suddenly, Zhao woke up screaming. She felt her skin burning and peeling away from her. She was engulfed in flames. Zhao heard the river running nearby, and on instinct, she got up and ran towards the sound. Her red sandals fell off and she stumbled forward. The killer looked on in shock. They couldn't believe Zhao had woken up. Eventually, the killer just ran towards her, not really sure what they were going to do. But before they reached her, Zhao had collapsed on the riverbank near a tree, still engulfed in flames. Zhao would let out one final scream, and then she would die. The killer waited several more minutes and just watched Zhao's body continue to burn. Then they grabbed the gas can, walked back across the water, picked up the bikes, and disappeared into the darkness. It would turn out Ho Lei-xiang, the warehouse worker who told Detective Sun that the steel pipe robbery could have been committed by Zhao's husband Li, was telling the truth. Li really had robbed the warehouse. But Ho was his partner in crime. Ho had masterminded the robbery, and then Li had sold the goods directly to a company he often worked with as a supplier, making them both a ton of money. Zhao's big secret, the one she had been desperately trying to hide from everybody, was that she knew what Ho and her husband had done. Because a couple of months after the robbery, Li had panicked and told Zhao everything. Zhao was disgusted and couldn't believe he had put his family in jeopardy just to make a quick buck. When Ho caught wind of all this drama, he decided he would step in and try to handle it. So he came up with this plan for Li to tell everybody he was going on a business trip, and then in reality, he would just go on the run. He would disappear from town. Zhao was aware of this plan, and she was under the impression that at some point, she and her daughter would also basically go on the run, connect with Li, and they would start a new life somewhere else. That's basically what Ho had promised them. But on July 25th, the day Zhao was killed, Ho went to see Zhao at her house, and he told her that Li had actually come back into town undercover. Ho said he could lead her to him, and then she and her husband could escape before the law caught up with them, and then once they were safe, they could send for their daughter and start their new life. However, later that night, when Ho and Zhao got across the river, it was Ho who whispered in Zhao's ear that Li wasn't there, and that in fact, he'd lured her here just to make sure she never told the police anything about the robbery. Then it was Ho who sexually assaulted Zhao and burned her to death. But that was not the only horrific crime Ho had committed. Because Li had followed his advice and planned to leave town and go into hiding like he suggested. But right before Li was about to leave town, which was days before Zhao was killed, Ho met up with Li, beat him to death with a hammer, and then disposed of his body outside of the city. So after all of this, Ho believed he'd gotten away with 2 murders. But when that letter that was supposedly written by Li arrived at Zhao's sister's house, Detective Sun compared it to other letters Li had written, and he quickly realized the handwriting didn't match. So Sun began working with a handwriting analysis expert and compared the letter to documents and correspondence from Li's family and friends, and from employees who worked at the warehouse that had been robbed, and that's how Sun figured out that Ho had actually written that letter. Police would eventually locate Li's body, at which point Ho would confess to everything. Ho was sentenced to death and was executed, all to cover up some stolen pipes. Located in the far northwestern section of Canada is the aptly named Northwest Territories. It is a massive swath of land that virtually nobody lives inside of. To make that point crystal clear, consider the following. The country of Germany has a population of 83 million people, give or take. The Northwest Territories is 4 times as large as Germany, but only has a population of about 50,000 people. In addition to being this huge and mostly unoccupied space, the Northwest Territories are almost completely wild. Think dense forests, huge mountains, massive rivers and lakes, and lots of really big animals. Even for highly experienced outdoors men and women, the Northwest Territories can be a truly hazardous place. And within this truly hazardous place, there is one part that is the most hazardous, and it's right in the middle of the Northwest Territories. And it's this 11,000 square mile stretch of just pure wilderness that's called the Nahanni Valley. In 1976, the Nahanni Valley was made into a national park. But don't let that fool you. This is not some family park that anybody can go to. There are no tourist accommodations, so there's no hotels, there's really nothing inside of it, and there are no roads that lead into this park. The only way you can get inside this valley is by plane or by boat or by very stressful and difficult overland hike. But for those who are able and willing to make the effort to get inside of this valley, you have the opportunity to explore one of the most beautiful places on the planet, because this section of the world is almost completely untouched by man. It is really nature at its purest form. However, there's a catch. This valley is said to be haunted. Over the last 10,000 years, the handful of native tribes that have attempted to settle inside of the Nahanni Valley have all either suddenly disappeared without a trace, like the Naha tribe, that literally overnight just was gone, leaving behind their shelters, their food, their supplies, just gone. No one knows what happened to them. Or the tribes have abruptly fled, claiming they were being terrorized or stalked by creatures lurking in the forest, like these white demons and these large wolves they called wahilas. Now, of course, this just sounds like folklore, and it might very well be that that's all it is, folklore. But starting in the early 1900s, some very strange things started happening in the Nahanni Valley that were not folklore. These things happened, and they were horrifying. These were horrifying, real events. And they might, depending on your viewpoint, give credit to some of the theories that the native tribespeople have about this valley, which is there's something evil lurking out in this forest, but we just don't know what it is. In 1904, three brothers, Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod, who all lived in the Northwest Territories, decided they wanted to go looking for gold in the Nahanni Valley. They figured, because so few people had ever been inside of this valley, that if there was gold to be found, then certainly it had not been found yet. And so after a very long and arduous journey using sled dogs and trains and homemade boats, they finally slipped into the valley and found themselves on what's called the Flat River, which runs right through the center of the Nahanni Valley. Now, the Flat River is kind of ironically named because it's anything but flat. It's actually more like a rapid at certain points. But either way, the three brothers, they're on their boat, they're making their way up the Flat River, and at some point they pull off onto the riverbank and they set up camp. And then once their camp is set up, they go down to the river and they put their gold sluices in the water. A gold sluice is this long, skinny box that's usually made of wood, and it has a strainer on one side. And gold miners will put it in the water, submerged, and they will kind of shovel the sediment on the bottom of the water into this little funnel, and the big stuff will get stopped by the strainer, and the dirt and the water will just kind of flow out the side. And so the idea is you can trap gold nuggets inside of this sluice. And so the three brothers, they get their sluices up and they start looking for gold, and right away they hit pay dirt. There is tons of gold in this river. And so all day, all night, they get all this gold. The next morning they do the same thing. And by the time all their containers are literally filled to the brim with gold, they decide, hey, let's go back and turn this in, get some money for it, and then come back out here. And so they pack up their tent, they pack up all their supplies, and they put everything back in their boat. They get out onto Flat River, and at some point, very early on in their journey back, the boat capsizes, and the boat actually breaks apart from the strength of the rapids of Flat River. And so the boat actually just sinks, and much of their supplies sink, including all of their gold. But the three brothers are able to grab some of their supplies, like their rifle and some lumber, and some of their mining supplies, and they swim it all to shore. So they catch their breath. They're totally devastated at the loss of the gold, but they're alive. They have enough supplies to survive. And so they figure all they can do is maybe try to go back to their original site, try to get some more gold because they did still have a sluice, and then try to get out of there and then, regroup and come back another time. And so using some of the lumber they recovered from their broken boat, and then also by cutting down some trees, they literally fashioned another boat and then hopped back on the Flat River, and they went back up to that site where they had found gold earlier. They set up their sluice, they set up their camp again, and this time they didn't find any gold. So all day, this very disappointing day that they've already lost all their gold, now they're not finding any more gold. And so that night when they went to bed, they decided that the next day they were just going to leave. And so the next day they get up, they pack up, they hop back on the Flat River on this new boat they built, and they're able to make their way out of the valley and get back to their homes. As soon as they get back home, the two younger brothers, Willie and Frank, start talking about how they want to go back into Nahanni Valley and go get more gold, because now they know there's gold out there. It's not a question, yeah, we didn't find it that second time, but we know it's out there. Charlie, the older brother, he wanted to get the gold, but he felt like, hey, that was a close call with the boat flipping over. I don't know if it's a good idea, so I'm actually not going to go. You guys can go, I'm going to stay. And so several months goes by, and Frank and Willie have been doing all this preparation for this additional trip into the valley. And finally, in 1905, they're ready. And so Willie, Frank, and a third man called Robert Weir, who was a friend of theirs, he was going to replace Charlie. The three of them, they make their way up into the valley. Now, they didn't tell anyone how long they were going to be gone for, and so when they didn't send any word and no one had heard from them in weeks, Charlie was actually not that concerned because he knew there was lots of gold to be had out in the Nahanni Valley, and so he figured they must have struck it rich, and now they've decided to live out there long term, or at least maybe through the summer, or maybe the next year. And so he wasn't concerned, and because he wasn't concerned, nobody else was concerned about these three men. And so weeks turned into months, turned into a year, and still no one's heard from these three men. No one's heard from Willie, Frank, or from Robert, but still Charlie maintains that nothing can be wrong because there's three of them out there. They're incredibly experienced. There is a ton of gold out there. I'm sure they're just killing it and they're just acquiring all this gold, and we're going to see them in the next couple of months maybe, and everything's going to be just fine. But a whole other year would go by. So they've been out there for 2 years and no one has heard from them. And at this point, Charlie thinks to himself, okay, I have to go out and see if they're okay. And so he rounds up 4 other people from his town and he mounts an expedition to head back into the Nahanni Valley to go find his 2 brothers and find Robert Weir. Charlie and his search party eventually, after yet another long and arduous journey, they get into Nahanni Valley and they get onto the Flat River. And so they start making their way upstream along Flat River. So it must have been a very treacherous journey getting through the rapids of this river. And the whole time they're scanning the left and the right side, hoping to see some sign of life. They're looking for any indication that these 3 men are out here and just fine, but they didn't see any sign of them. And so they finally made their way all the way up to the very end of Flat River, or I should say the very beginning of Flat River, where it breaks off from a much larger river called the South Nahanni River. And once they turned onto the South Nahanni River, they began going downstream. And again, they're looking on either side for any sign of these 3 men. There's no sign of them. And then the river they're on takes a very sharp turn. It's actually called the Big Bend, and it's about a 45-degree turn. And as soon as you make that turn, it dumps you into this 10-mile stretch of river called Second Canyon. Now, along South Nahanni River, which is about 350 miles long, there are these 4 canyons that the water passes through. And they're labeled 4th Canyon, 3rd Canyon, 2nd Canyon, and 1st Canyon. And these canyons are massive. These sheer cliffs on either side of the river shoot up to 3,000 feet above the water. And in some parts, the water is actually just as deep, thousands of feet deep. And Second Canyon is unique because the cliff faces are as sheer as you're going to get. And the cliff faces almost butt up exactly up against the water. So there's really very little shoreline on either side. So once you're in this 10-mile stretch, you're basically boxed in. You have thousands of feet of water below you. You have these massive cliffs on either side, and there's really nowhere to go. You need to get through this section of the river before you can effectively get onto the shoreline and take a break from being in your boat. And along these cliffs are these openings you see high up all over the cliffs on both sides that are openings to these massive cave systems inside of these thousands of feet tall cliffs. And because of how difficult it is to not only get to Nahanni Valley, but also to get up to these different cave openings, nobody's gone inside of them. We don't know what's inside of these caves, save for the few that are down low enough that people can explore. So as you're passing through Second Canyon, it's almost like you're being watched because there's all these openings, but you can't see into them, and you're just forced to go down this 10-mile stretch, and you can't really go anywhere, and whatever's watching you, it's watching you. As soon as Charlie and his search party entered into Second Canyon, it would have immediately gotten darker because that's another part of being in Second Canyon. These huge cliff walls of this canyon obscure the sunlight. And so they would have entered into this canyon, it would have gotten darker, and it's very windy inside of Second Canyon. So the winds would have picked up, so it's dark, very strange setting for them to be in, and they would have been looking on either side at these little strips of shoreline on either side, barely big enough for a boat to be. They would have been looking for any sign of life, but they didn't see anything. As they're making their way down this 10-mile stretch, as they're getting closer and closer to actually entering into First Canyon, which is the next canyon you would enter into, the sides of the river start to get slightly larger where you could actually beach a boat. There's some trees. And on the left-hand side, right before exiting Second Canyon, they notice there is actually a tent perched within some trees. And so the search party naturally goes right over to the shoreline. They hop out, but as soon as they step foot on land and they have a clearer view of this tent and what's outside of it, they notice there is a body clearly lying on the ground outside of the tent. And so Charlie and the search party, they run over, and as soon as they're up close, they can tell this body is missing its head. And they see the clothes on this body are totally charred and burned, and whoever this was, they were reaching with their right arm when they died. And right outside of the reach of their right arm was a rifle that was propped up against a tree. And so they walk around this one body and they go around towards the backside of the tent where the opening to this tent is, and they find another body, another very badly decomposed body, and it's positioned kind of halfway in the tent and halfway out of the tent. And there's a blanket kind of partially obscuring this person's body, and when they move the blanket, they see this body too is missing its head. So Charlie and the search party, they continue to search around the camp in hopes of finding the heads of these two people to try to figure out who they are, but they never find the heads. However, they do find some personal effects both in the pockets of these two bodies and then also inside the tent that would confirm these are Charlie's brothers. As for the third man that had been with them, Robert Weir, he was not at the campsite, and in fact, he would never actually be found officially. However, a little ways down the river, another partial skeleton would be found several months later that was attributed to Robert. However, that was not 100% confirmed to be Robert. The only other interesting thing that was found at this campsite was a carving in a nearby tree, and it just said, "We have found a fine prospect," indicating that Charlie's brothers had found gold. But there was no gold either on them or in their camp or in the river nearby. Nothing. There was no gold. Charlie and his search party would leave the valley and get in touch with the mounted police, who would come out to the site where the brothers had been found. They would launch an investigation, and ultimately they would come to the conclusion that all three of these men, the two brothers and Robert, had starved to death, and then after they had perished, animals had taken them off, which is why Robert was found so far away and why the skulls were missing from the two brothers. Now, Charlie did not believe that. He believed they had been attacked by native tribes in the area, but the police were not buying that. They said this was a natural thing, this was an accident, and so that's that. When the story of these two decapitated men made the news, people went crazy about this. People were very divided about what they thought really happened. There was a percentage of people that believed that partial skeleton that was found, that was not Robert Weir. He had not died. He had murdered the two brothers, decapitated them, and then made off with their gold. The other percentage of people believed that all three men, the two brothers and Robert, had been attacked by a person, a group of people, an animal, a creature, something. There was some sort of attack. And that's why the two brothers were in those positions that indicated they had encountered something horrifying, with one brother reaching for the gun and the other appearing to have leapt from his bed before he ultimately died. But regardless of which side you fell on, pretty much everybody at the time who heard about the story became terrified of the Nahanni Valley. Specifically, they became terrified of that stretch in Second Canyon where the two brothers had been found. And so actually that stretch got renamed the Headless Valley, and from that point forward, that's all it was known as. And so even though there were obvious gold prospects in the Headless Valley and all along the South Nahanni River and the Flat River, people after this story broke were just not prepared to risk going in there and potentially becoming another victim. And so people kind of stayed away from Nahanni Valley. 8 years later, though, in 1913, a gold prospector named Martin Jorgensen decided, you know what? I'm not going to let some scary stories about some headless men and, ghosts and killers on the loose. I'm not going to let any of that get in the way of me taking gold out of Nahanni Valley. So, all on his own, Martin makes the arduous trek inside of Nahanni Valley. He makes his way up Flat River, and he finally finds a spot about 70 miles upstream of where Headless Valley was, and he actually built a one-room cabin, because he was going to stay there through the winter, and then the plan was he would meet up with his partners the following summer. And so right after he got there, he set up his sluices and he started mining for gold, and apparently he found a lot of it, because he sent word back to his partners outside of the valley that he had made it rich. And so his partners were really excited to meet up with him the following summer and see how much he got, because they planned on going back into the valley with him that summer. So that summer rolls around, his partners go to the meeting spot right outside the valley, but Martin doesn't show up. And so his partners, they stay outside at this meeting space for several days until finally, when he doesn't show up, they decide, we have to go in there and see if he is okay, because at this point he should have been here. There's no excuse. And so they end up going into the Nahanni Valley. They make their way up Flat River and they go roughly to the area where they knew he was staying based on the message he had sent earlier. He had described where he was staying, and they actually found his cabin, or I should say they found what was left of his cabin. His cabin had been completely torched, burned to the ground, and laying on the ground next to the burned out cabin was the burned out remains of another headless corpse. And this corpse belonged to Martin Jorgensen. The police did a thorough investigation, but they were never able to determine what actually killed him. The police did not connect Martin's death with the two McLeod brothers' deaths, even though they were all decapitated. They were in roughly the same area, and it happened within a few years of each other, and they looked very, very similar. Even though that all was true, the police said, nope, these are totally separate. Martin died for some reason, and then animals took parts of him away, and that's why his skull is missing. Martin's skull was never located, and the gold that Martin claimed to have struck it rich with was also not at the cabin, not on him. There was no gold anywhere in the vicinity. When Martin's death made the news, people went crazy, and despite the police assuring everyone that his death was not connected to the McLeod brothers' deaths, even though the police were saying that, the public didn't see it that way. It was just too easy to connect one decapitation with two other decapitations that have happened close together in a relatively short time frame, and so a lot of people assumed there must be a killer on the loose somewhere in Nahanni Valley. 7 years later, in 1921, the rumors of a killer on the loose were still alive and well when gold prospector John O'Brien and his partner decided, you know what? Despite the rumors of the so-called killer or whatever's going on in the Nahanni Valley, let's go into the Nahanni Valley and try our hand. Let's try to get some gold. And so the two of them made their way into the valley, and they set up camp in Headless Valley, not far from where the McLeod brothers had been found decapitated. So they set up their camp, and they're there for a couple of days. They're doing well. They're finding gold. And then at some point, John tells his partner that he's going to go out and check all of their traps along the river, and he'll be back in about 8 or 9 days. And so his partner waits 8 or 9 days, and John doesn't come back. And a couple of days after that goes by, and now John's past due, and so the partner decides he has to go out looking for him. And so there was another gold prospector in the area, and so this partner contacted him, and the two of them went to the river and began walking upstream until they found John. And he had frozen to death, but it was very interesting the way he was positioned. He was sitting in front of this obviously previously lit campfire. He wasn't hunched over, but he didn't look like he was in pain. He looked like he was just enjoying the fire. There was nothing on his face that indicated discomfort or pain or fear. He was even holding the matchbook in his hand. It was like he was just sitting there enjoying the fire when something caused him to suddenly freeze. In fact, witnesses would say John looked like he had been flash frozen, as if it had happened in a matter of seconds, because it didn't look like he had reacted properly to freezing to death. And the police, when they came out, they would say, this is odd. This is odd the way he's positioned, but ultimately he died because he froze to death, and so there's no foul play here, and so no further investigation is needed. 5 years later, in 1926, a hunting party that included a young woman named Annie Lafferty was camping out along the Flat River inside of Headless Valley. And so that night, they're all kind of joking around the fire, and then at some point they decide to all go to sleep. And then the next day, when everybody gets up, Annie is no longer in camp. And there's no sign of where she went. And so they begin by yelling out and walking around the immediate vicinity to see maybe if she stepped away for a minute, but Annie's just gone, and no one knows where she went. And so the hunting party spends the rest of the day looking for Annie, but there's no sign of her. They ultimately leave the valley. They tell police. Police come out. There's this huge search, but Annie's never found. Several months later, a man named Charlie, who happened to have been out near Flat River, near this hunting party when they were out there, but Charlie himself was not in the hunting party. He didn't know Annie. He was just in the vicinity. He overheard someone talking about a member of that hunting party, specifically a woman, going missing. And when he heard that, he knew he had to tell police what he had seen that night out near Flat River. So he goes to police and he explains that that night when he knew there was this hunting party over there, he could hear them, he knew they were over there. He said at some point he went to bed and then he woke up when he heard the sound of rocks falling into the river in front of him. He was sleeping along the river's edge. So he sits up and he looks out across the river. It's totally dark, but there's some moonlight and he's kind of looking around wondering what's causing the sound, but he can't see it. And then he hears it again and he can tell it's off to his left. And these are not huge rocks. These are like medium to small size rocks, like rocks you could just pick up and throw. And so he's looking and all of a sudden he sees maybe a couple hundred yards away through some sparse trees, he sees a naked woman, a white naked woman running on all fours up this mountainside. And as she's running up the mountainside, her feet and her hands are knocking little rocks into the river down below. She's right on the edge of this cliff. And as she's running up this hill, she stops and she turns and he gets a good look at her face. And Charlie would say he was so taken aback by her face. It looked like she was possessed. There was something wrong with her face. And so Charlie instinctively ducked down and chose not to follow her, even though he knew anybody running naked anywhere in the wilds is doomed. But he felt like he could not go near this woman. There was something wrong with this woman. And so the police, they take this story down and they say, hey, this is what Annie looked like. And Charlie would say, I think that's her. I think that matches her description. And so universally, it's believed this woman galloping up this hillside in the middle of the night naked was Annie. Police ultimately would not investigate Annie's disappearance any further because at the time Charlie was telling them this piece of information, she'd already been gone for months and the assumption was she was dead. 4 years later, in 1931, another gold prospector decides to try their luck in Headless Valley. A man named Phil Powers. He makes his way into the valley. He finds a spot off of Flat River. He builds a cabin. And then shortly thereafter, his cabin burns to the ground with him inside of it. Now, his skeleton was intact, but the strange thing about his death is based on the origin of the fire, which would have been on the roof. He should have had an opportunity to climb out of the cabin before it burned down, giving rise to the theory that he was actually dead before the fire started. However, the police said this was an accident caused by Phil doing something with the stovepipe that led to it catching on fire, and this was just all one big accident. But the vast majority of people that have followed along to this point with all of these strange deaths, they were just not buying it. 5 years later, in 1936, two more gold prospectors, William Epler and Joseph Mulholland, they entered the Headless Valley to try their luck, and shortly after arriving and getting set up, they went missing. A search party came out to look for them, and they found their cabin, and just like Phil Powers, it had burned to the ground, but William and Joseph were not in the ashes. They were not anywhere nearby. In fact, they were never found. No one has any idea what happened to them, and no one knows what caused the fire. 9 years later, in 1945, yet another gold prospector named Ernest Sabbard entered the Headless Valley to go looking for gold, and then when he did not leave the valley for an intended rendezvous with some of his partners went looking for him, and they would find him inside of his sleeping bag, laying down, decapitated right along the Flat River inside of the Headless Valley. And so the police would come out, they would do an investigation, and they would call this an accident where, he starved to death or he died of hypothermia. And then after he was dead, animals must have come in and removed his skull, and that's why we can't find it. And so the police did not, at least not publicly, connect his death to all of the other decapitations in that small area. 1 year later, in 1946, another gold miner named John Patterson went into Headless Valley and he went missing. And so a search party went in looking for him, and John would never be found. But on one of the last nights that the search party was in the Headless Valley, they were camping out near Flat River, some native tribes people came into their camp and they warned them about some white figures that were walking around the valley that night. They're down near the river, they're out in the forest, they're kind of all around here, and so you really need to be careful. You don't want them to see you. And then these tribes people just left. And so the search party is absolutely horrified. They know about the rumors of this place. They're out here looking for someone that's gone missing in this place. And all night, all they hear are distant howls and screams that they hadn't heard in the previous nights. They're hearing these wailing sounds coming from all around them, like these things that are out there were intentionally trying to scare them to get them to leave. It felt like they were not supposed to be there. The next day, first thing when they got up and they left, the leader of that search party would say he just felt like the whole valley was totally sinister, and that constant wailing they heard the night before, he said he will never forget. From the mid-1940s onward, there have been far less strange incidents reported inside of Nahanni Valley, but one could attribute that to the fact that far less people have been going into Nahanni Valley ever since the 1940s. And in recent times, huge segments of the park have been permanently closed. The park has said the reason they're doing that is to protect that segment of the park. But other people have speculated that at least part of the reason why they're closing these segments, many of which are right near the Headless Valley, is because they're trying to protect people from getting anywhere near whatever it is that's lurking inside of that park. But regardless, it is still a fact that over the last century, there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of people that have either gone missing or who have died under very mysterious circumstances inside of this valley. And the truth is, nobody. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the 5-star review button over to your kid's birthday party and then ask them if they want to hit the piñata. When they say yes, put their blindfold on and then replace the piñata with a beehive. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on